Hello, everybody. My name's Jim, and this is my reading wrap up for February 2024. I read 6 books this month, so I have a lot to get through. I'm going to talk about them as usual from lowest rated to highest rated. And unfortunately, the first book on this list is Superheroes Are Everywhere by Kamala Harris. The premise of this book was great. It's so important for kids to understand that there are people around them who are pretty extraordinary. They're respectable. They do their jobs well. They take care of people. They're nice. you know? So to point them out and say that they are superheroes, they are the heroes in the community, is good for children to see so that they don't think that this sort of thing is just a fantasy. That there are people who can do amazing things for others. And Kamala Harris listed out some of the people in her life that she grew up respecting. But there were 2 things that took this book down to a 3-star rating. Number 1, it was very dense. There was a lot of text on the page. So I feel like a child reading this by themselves could potentially lose interest. But number 2, she, at the end, kind of made herself a hero. She said, and in conclusion, this is why I am also a hero, because I help children like you. Instead of wrapping everything up in a nice little bow and giving a final thank you to all of the people who were heroes in her life to help her achieve what she was able to achieve. I think this book was written when she was a senator, so she wasn't quite yet vice president. I respect her. I respect her position. I respect her intellect. She is certainly a hero to a lot of people. And so, I don't deny that at all. But just a little modesty would go a long way. There's a checklist at the end on how to be a hero for these children to read if they want to, and modesty is not on that list. And for what it's worth, I don't get into politics on this channel, so please don't leave any political comments down below. I will always say that it's about the policy and not the politician. I'll leave it at that. Moving forward, we are going to talk about Better Than a Box of Chocolates by Emily Marsh. This was also a 3-star read. This is a romance. I wanted to read this because it felt very Valentine's Day, just based on the cover itself. It was a quick read, so I didn't feel like I would be bogged down by the romance elements that I knew I would not like. However, I will say that Emily Marsh is a good writer. I didn't mind the pacing of this book. Great author. I don't know if I'm going to pick up more of her books. Just like with Emily Henry, amazing author, great writing, but romance is just not a genre that I pick up all the time. So, for all those romance people out there, pick up Emily Marsh, give her a try. This is part of a huge series. I feel like this was maybe a book wedged between part 12 and 13, so this was like 12.5. But the premise of this book is this wedding photographer named Allie Lovejoy, because of course that's her last name, goes back to this small town to help her friend Jessica retake some engagement photos. And this small town is kind of a mix between Christmas and Valentine's Day. It's not the same as Nightmare Before Christmas, but you get where I'm going, where the meshing of 2 holidays is just a neat idea. So I thought that whole setting was pretty cool visually in my brain. Things happen, there's a meet cute, and the story just goes on from there. I'm not going to give too many details, but there were some things that happened during the meet cute that were so cliche that I don't think they were meant to be funny. Some of the lines, well, maybe. This was kind of a humorous book, but I ended up laughing out loud just because of how awkward and cliche it was. So that's how I am with most romances. But there were some scenes that I felt could have been extended or could have been taken more advantage of, but Emily Marsh didn't do that. It felt pretty standard. It was okay, and that's why I ended up giving it a 3-star rating. It almost got 4 though. So, it's pretty cute for a romance if you know exactly what to expect. If you know the kind of corniness that some romances have, if you go into this with those expectations, then you're going to be fine. So, yeah, it was good. Was it better than a box of chocolates? No. Maybe the ones with raisins. And I'm not a big chewy caramel person, so yeah, it was better than the caramels as well. But like cherry cordials, no. Absolutely not. Cherry Cordial is a 5-star chocolate. That's not this. The Drift by CJ Tudor is a book that I started in December and was finally able to finish in February. And it's not because the story was boring that it took me so long to finish it. It's because I had to put the book on hold in the library, and who knew that so many people want to read wintry thrillers in the wintertime? Makes no sense, right? So I had to wait. There were a couple of people before me before I could check the book out again. I was able to do that in February, kind of at the beginning. I was able to finish it. I really enjoyed this book. It was recommended by Michaela at Michaela Reads as a wintry book to read, a wintry thriller that she enjoyed as well. So thank you for the recommendation, Michaela. I really did enjoy this book. The beginning was a bit slow, and I'll get into that with the premise. So there are 3 characters in this story: Hannah, Meg, and Carter. Yes, Carter. Before, when I talked about this book, I said that both Meg and Hannah were stuck in coaches or like tour buses that ran off the road. But no, Hannah is stuck in a coach. Meg is stuck suspended above everything in a cable car. So they're in 2 separate places. It's very enclosed, very tight. Everything around them is wintry. It's snowy, it's white, it's foggy. You can't see anything in front of you. And then Carter is an employee at the retreat that Meg and Hannah are attempting to reach in this story. So it's this semi-luxurious, I guess, place that I think CJ Tudor could have played on a bit more, because the retreat is such a different environment from the blanket of white snow outside that could potentially get old and boring. And that's part of why the beginning was so slow, is that the environment just felt a little same, especially between Hannah and Meg. And then when Carter went outside, it was more of the same thing. So I feel like CJ Tudor could have really played up more on that different environment, the building itself. But anyway, they're stuck in this situation. There are a lot of characters, and Michaela mentioned this as well, where there's a bit of character soup in the beginning. In fact, there are literal roll call moments in this story where we are introduced to a ton of characters. As the story continues, you do get to familiarize yourself with the characters a little bit more, but in the beginning it was a bit overwhelming. Once I got past that introductory phase, the story moved on at a speedy pace, and I was able to finish this book very quickly in February. It was great. Lots of twists. I enjoyed all of the point of views. This was a great recommendation by Michaela, so again, thank you. If you are looking for a wintry book for the tail end of winter, well, I guess it's March now, so oops. If it's still snowing where you are, if you live in like Canada or something, maybe you see a little white and you want to read something wintry to go with it, then definitely pick up this thriller. It's great. It's kind of gross at some points. There are definitely some parts in this story that have stuck in my head because of how nasty they were. So be careful with that. The last 3 books in this wrap up are all 5-star books. The first that I want to talk about is The Talk by Darren Bell. This was recommended by Angelia at Read and Reread. It's a graphic novel memoir that Darren Bell has written about himself. He is highly decorated as an artist. He's won a Pulitzer Prize. He has been seen in a number of publications, and he goes through that in this story. But really the focus is about the talk, where parents have to find the time and just the words to sit their child down and say, this is a possibility. This is how the world may see you. It's devastating. Darren Bell wrote about this talk that he had with his mother, who happened to be white and wanted to protect him. He wanted to have a water gun just like all of his friends, but she made it very clear to him that he was not allowed to have one that looks realistic. He has to have one that's neon green, I think, just so the cops don't assume that he is pulling out a real gun. And of course, immediately when you think about that situation, you think about Tamir Rice. At least I did. I thought about him throughout this entire book after the talk. But this is a memoir about how Darren Bell, from that moment, navigated the world, understanding that people may mean something different from the words they say and the actions that they take in regards to their interactions with Darren. And then also there were some events that took place throughout his lifetime that he wanted to note. So many events that directly impacted his life he wrote about. The only downside to this graphic novel that I could even think of is that some of the panels just went by too fast. I wanted him to linger on some of the stories, and it could just be the nature of this being a graphic novel. It just seemed to go by too fast. So I am going to reread this for sure at some point later, because I do want to find some of those that I felt went by too fast and just kind of force myself to hang on them. There is so much in this graphic novel that I could take away, and while it does cover some intense topics, there is humor, there's a lot of relatability. In fact, Darren Bell makes a point to call out some of his own flaws in how he sees certain people. The way that he accentuates some of the cells and makes them a bit more realistic compared to others that are a bit more cartoony is just really, really thoughtfully done to really put emphasis on some of the events in his life that he had to traverse. So yeah, if you want a graphic novel, if you want a book that you can get through really quickly, it's huge. I have the hardcover version of the talk. It is heavy. Just know that when you get this book, it's a big one. It's a big one, but you'll enjoy it. These next two books received the same score, but there is one that I think is a clear winner over the other one. So I'm going to talk about Mr. Bridge by Evan S. Connell first. I thought it was Connell, but apparently it's Connell. I read Mrs. Bridge back in 2021. I enjoyed it. I gave it 4 stars, but I'm going to reread it and I'll probably give it 5 stars too, because I think I enjoyed it either more so or just as much. I do remember reading Mrs. Bridge, and there was one thing that was kind of brushed off, shrugged off, but now after reading Mr. Bridge, I kind of get it. So yeah, I might have to bump Mrs. Bridge's star rating up 1. Anyway, this story is pretty simple. The premise is simple. It's really the family life. It takes place in the 1930s and continues on. It's really weird to say that I enjoyed this book so much considering the person that Mr. Bridge is. He was very stubborn in the way that he thought about certain people, but the reason why I enjoyed this book, I think it hinged on every single character around him having the wherewithal to check him whenever he had these thoughts. There was never a moment in this book where I thought that Mr. Bridge had an attaboy, where somebody agreed with some of these awful things that he was thinking. So, in a way, while he was the main character, it really highlighted everybody else and their progressive thoughts in the 1930s into, whatever else, the 1940s, because this went through World War II as well. In Mrs. Bridge, it wasn't as pronounced because Mrs. Bridge was the focus of that story. And while she was bigoted, she did not have those same recurring thoughts as Mr. Bridge. I feel like Mrs. Bridge was much more inclined to learn. So if you were to read this duology, and I'm kicking myself for not reading Mr. Bridge immediately after Mrs. Bridge too, because a lot of the things that happened in this story I could recall from the others. They weren't exact one-to-one scenes, which I appreciated. There were 2 reasons why I didn't want to read Mr. Bridge. Number 1, I didn't think that I would like this book as much for the reasons that I just said, but Evan S. Connell did such a good job of all of this with all the side characters that I didn't mind it as much. I was happy to see him checked. And number 2, I was worried that I was going to get the same exact scenes that I had in Mrs. Bridge. Mr. Bridge is a little bit longer, so I assumed that there was just going to be some extra stuff to read there, but it really wasn't. It was not a one-to-one to Mrs. Bridge. Everything is split up into vignettes as well, which makes this a bit easier to read. I can understand that this book could possibly be boring to some people because it is just kind of like the day-to-day life of the Bridge family. If you are going to read this duology, if I've convinced you, do read Mrs. Bridge first. If you read this one first, you're probably not going to like Mrs. Bridge because you're going to think maybe that she has the exact same thoughts that he does, which is not the case. She is much less butt-headed than he is. So do read Mrs. Bridge first. It's shorter. It's a taste of this. And finally, the best book, even though it received the same score, it just has to do with my scoring system and nothing more. The Color Purple by Alice Walker. This was the best book that I read in February for sure. I will go as far as to say that there were moments in this book where I got the pachinko feels. Everybody knows how I feel about pachinko. That is my favorite book of all time. I would be lying if I said that I did not see this book in December being in my top books of 2024. This is the story of Celie, mostly. She... God, this book starts off so rough. And just real quickly, it started off so rough in a way that I thought that the whole book would be this way. I've never seen the movie or anything, so this was my first experience with The Color Purple. I knew that it was a modern classic. I knew that it was beloved. So I trucked through it. I'm so happy I did. But the first part of this book, maybe 15%, maybe more, Celie is SA'd by her father. As a child, she is forced into a marriage that she doesn't want, where she is also abused. It's really difficult to get through the first part. You really feel for her. You want her to find an outlet somehow, and that is how she began writing to God, writing letters to God. It's an epistolary. Epistolaries are pretty hit or miss. I've read a few. This one was interesting to me because, in a way, sometimes it was a bit weird where, for instance, Celie would say, "Dear God," and then jump into the dialogue of another character. But then, on the other hand, I really appreciated the letters that she was writing as a way to express herself, as a way to have that outlet to free her mind from so much trauma that she had to endure. And it really isn't until she meets someone else where this story starts to turn around. It's important that you get there. In this story, there's also Nettie, who is a missionary in a small community in Africa. Nettie and Celie end up writing back and forth as sisters do. And there's one thing that Alice Walker, I mean, there are plenty of things. This story's amazing, so just read it if you want to. One thing that I really appreciated about Alice Walker is her ability to create character voices. And I don't mean character voices in the sense of like dialect, accents, grammar, things like that, because there is that too. There are characters who use certain words over other ones in the way that they speak and in the way that they write. But these characters really jump out at you. Each of them has their own unique, strong voice. Strong is a very broad term. I could break that down in many ways. They are strong in their motivations. They are strong in the way that they literally speak, how they affect each other. That is something that I got from Pachinko, and that is something that I got from here too. Just the way that Alice Walker was to create such human characters who go through trauma, who go through joyous experiences as well, and both of those experiences are equally portrayed on the page. It's a great book. It's probably cliche to say that this is one of the best books that I've ever read because it's one of the best books that I think a lot of people have ever read, but there's a reason for that. And now I guess I could just say I'm one of them. Give The Color Purple a try. Get past that first 15%, and I really hope that you appreciate the book as well as I did. I could go into specifics, but I don't want to. I don't want to even really hint so much more. After what I've already said, I'm going to ramble if I keep talking. So, 5 stars. Awesome. Best book that I read in February. Maybe will end up in my best of 2024. I'm calling it right now. And I just said maybe. So, like, I'm calling what? A maybe? Okay. But I think it will. Anyway, I'm sorry. If you are interested in any of the books that I talked about today, their Goodreads links are in the description below. Click on those. Head on over to the retailer of your choice if you're feeling brave and purchase them for yourself, or go to your library or use your library app to borrow them if they are available. If you enjoyed this video for whatever reason, please leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Otherwise, I've been Jim. You've been great. Happy reading.